This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Dad would discuss it. He said, let's hope it won't come. When they did come, my oldest brother was old enough to go. As I got older, I got into it, then the next one. If it had been any longer, they would have had the whole family in there.
Everybody knew there was going to be a war. Young men were coming in from all over the place, you know. Besides, there was the Depression on, there was no work. The Army was the best place to be.
In some ways, we sort of dreaded it because we knew it would take us away from our family and our expected careers.
In regiments like the West Nova Scotia Regiment and others like it in Atlantic Canada, there's a tremendous number of individuals who do see that another war with Germany is coming. And they're willing to train and make ready for it.
And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
The Great War took a terrible toll on Canada's military. Despite memories of loved ones lost, working-class people answered the call of duty to be Canada's citizen soldiers. Thousands of young men risked their lives or made the ultimate sacrifice to fight tyranny across the globe.
There's a great number of historians who would suggest that Canada is absolutely not ready for war in 1939. And they're facing tremendous pressure to deliver social programs at a time when Germany's rearming. Well, what kind of government do Canadians want? Do they want a government that's going to create the new kind of Canada that is going to aid its citizens in that kind of economic crisis? Or do they want a militaristic, fascist Canada that's going to respond to Nazi-like with like?
When war broke out in September of 1939, men like Harry Eisenhower, an 18-year-old reserve member from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, signed up to bolster Canada's meager armed forces.
On the day the war broke out, I was in Pictou County. I sent a letter to Colonel Bullock of the West Novas telling him where I was, and I got a telegram saying report for duty in Bridgewater at once. So I did.
Gerald Weatherall Bullock was the commander of the West Nova Scotia Regiment. He was an Anglican minister and a veteran of the Great War. His immediate problem was finding a place to house the hundreds of men heading to Bridgewater to sign up for military service. The only area suitable for training was the grounds of the Bridgewater exhibition. The men quickly filled the main buildings, overflowing into the cattle and poultry sheds that were hastily converted into cookhouses and mess halls. The men began training immediately, marching around town wearing civilian clothes. They displayed a startling lack of equipment, as each man was issued just one piece of military clothing.
My piece of military equipment was a military belt, which I wore over an old suit. And I wore that the whole time I was there.
Reserve units are close-knit groups, often family members. Victor Dukeshire and his brother Garth would become platoon mates in the same company of the regiment.
I was called Duke Jr., he was Duke Sr. That was one of their names. Everybody had a nickname.
Douglas Strickland and a friend would leave their hometown in Prince Edward Island on a long bike ride to Nova Scotia. He would eventually become a member of the West Nova Scotia Regiment.
So we decided we were going down to the valley to pick apples. So we got on our bike and went down to the valley, and we were a week too early. So then we drove the bike down to Halifax and then joined the Halifax Rifles.
Reg Bullock, son of Lieutenant Colonel Bullock, would also enlist. At 19, he was a courageous and energetic young man, ready to prove himself.
He was sort of, I think, a happy-go-lucky sort of fellow. Minister sons were sometimes like that. They're trying to prove that they weren't as stolid as their parents.
It may seem unusual to some that Bullock, a man of the cloth, would organize and train men for war.
Who better to organize something like a reserve force regiment than a minister who has a large parish to look after and who is accustomed to driving all over that parish, pulling people together to host events, and using the telephone to mobilize manpower in times of local crisis. Bullock is the right man for the job in 1939 to get the regiment ready, get men into boots, get men starting to train with something, even if it's broom handles, until they can get the first wave of equipment that starts to flow out of stocks in Halifax and Ottawa and other parts of Ontario.
Leaving the cold floors of the exhibition grounds of Bridgewater for the winter quarters of Aldershot seemed like a welcome move. In December 1939, however, Aldershot was a clearing in the woods with few permanent buildings. The majority of men would be sleeping in tents, and with a classic winter storm greeting them on their arrival, one soldier was heard saying, "Boys, we've traded a devil for a witch." Thankfully, it was only 3 weeks until they boarded a train for Halifax, where the Polish ship Crowbury waited to take them across the Atlantic. Too young to serve overseas, Harry Eisenhower returned to Halifax and his courses at Dalhousie. He continued with the Officers' Training Corps. There, he met Harvey Jones, a bright and determined young recruit from Dartmouth, and their friendship grew throughout the war.
I don't have too much of a recollection of him. I could be just one of the boys, at that time. But when the Army sent out a request for the COTC officers to sign up as reinforcement officers to go overseas, I reported to Halifax, and when I got there, I discovered that Harvey was the only other person who had replied to this request.
Flanked by 2 Canadian destroyers, their beloved Nova Scotia disappeared into the murky fog astern. Many would not return home. After 2 days at sea, the destroyer escorts turned back on Christmas Eve. Aboard the Crowbury, there was a mix of anticipation and excitement as the men prepared for celebration, Christmas at sea. Traveling with them, wartime correspondent Gregory Clark would later write about that night.
7 of my 70 Christmases have been spent strangely and afar. From them I was able to prove that Christmas catches you wherever you are. And the strangest of them was spent in the midwinter mid-Atlantic. What a setting for 5 p.m. of a Christmas Eve. We sat huddled in the Polish liner Crowbury and no doubt thought of home, for most of the 1,208 of us would not see home again for 5 years. Many of us would never see it again. The unit the Crowbury was carrying was the West Nova Scotia Regiment, a rugged brotherhood of fishermen, miners, farmers, apple growers, heading towards the big lower saloon of the liner. Up rises Lieutenant Colonel Reverend Gerald Wetherell Bullock, who raised and recruited this battalion and who now commands it. and the lieutenant colonel put on his surplice and his vestments over his soldier's uniform and conducted the office of the Anglican prayer book that marks the nativity of our Lord, and no man in that great ship's jammed belly moved. Excerpts from Gregory Clark, a retelling of the Stilly Night.
As the Crowbury approached the coast of Ireland, all men were on high alert. This was U-boat territory. They would be vigilant until they arrived in Scotland on New Year's Day, 1940. 3 weeks later, Bullock gathered the men for inspection by the King of England. King George slowly walked along the West Nova Scotia lines. Lieutenant Colonel Bullock proudly introduced each of his officers. When the king reached the end, Bullock led the regiment in 3 roaring cheers. It was a symbolic end to his command. With his work done, the 55-year-old Bullock handed the regiment to younger commanders, leaders like Milton Gregg and finally Pat Bogart. They would guide the regiment through the rigors of training for the next several months.
We'd march on the old road or something and get into a place where that we could raid one another. Sometimes it'd be 2 and 3 platoons.
The training was lengthy and brutal, though it didn't compare to the overwhelming losses the Allies were suffering, such as the Battle of Dunkirk in May of 1940. Nor did it prepare them for the unimaginable experience of the Blitz and the cleanup efforts through London's blasted rubble.
There's nothing like enduring the Blitz alongside the British people to convince them that this is the right thing to do. When they help lift the timbers off the babies in the basements of English houses, that convinces them that Germany has to be stopped.
Life in England was bittersweet. There was a job to do, prepare for war, but these 20-somethings were beginning to build relationships and families.
Bill Sexton asked me one night if I would go on a double date with him because his girlfriend had a girlfriend. And I did, and she actually became my girlfriend for the whole time I was in England.
The boys were quickly coming of age, looking out for one another. But tragedy was not isolated to the front lines. 27-year-old Orrin Foster earned a British Empire Medal before even seeing battle.
The train crossing the river, it wasn't a wide river either, but it was fairly deep, pretty deep.
It was January 1942 when a crew of West Novas were practicing a routine river crossing. The small boat capsized, throwing them into the frigid water wearing full military kit. The heavy equipment pulled them down. Not knowing how to swim, Foster launched a one-man boat into the current. He saved 4 men, paddling with one hand and holding their heads above water with the other. But 6 men perished.